Well, again, my name is Bob Hult. I'm with Bishop & Associates, market research firm, specifically for the electronic connector industry. And we've focused, I've specifically focused on high-speed backplane connector systems for about the past 20 years. And over that period of time, I've watched connectors being rated from megabits to gigabits, and with some of the most recent connector systems now in the backplane arena rated to 112 gigabits. But more recently, over the past couple of years, I've kind of changed my focus, and I'm looking more at fiber optics for a number of good reasons, actually, because the data center is an opportunity to look at where optics can really shine. And when you look at a data center, it's really a series of boxes, routers, switches, network equipment, all needs different kinds of interconnects, different bandwidths, and it's a huge number. And it's a great opportunity to look at where optics can offer some real advantages. And they're growing. There's no question about it. The data centers are growing like topsy right now. There's $100 billion in capital expenditure put into expansion of data centers with 15% compound annual growth rates, which is pretty significant. Cloud data transmission is now being measured in zettabytes, which is 10 to the 21st in scientific notation. It's kind of a Carl Sagan number, if you're familiar with Carl, with his billions and billions of stars. Zettabytes are even a much greater number. It's hard to get your head around that kind of a number. Anyway, a typical hyperscale data center consists of 100,000 servers, 10,000 switches, and potentially 1 million optical interconnects. So it's a great test bed for optics. And it's accelerating. In 2022, we were looking at roughly, and one estimate at least, of about 80 zettabytes of data being transmitted within the networks. In 2025, we're estimating that to almost double again. So the rate of increase is almost logarithmic. So they're looking for ways to how they're going to be able to support that. And when you look at how they're going to do this, what's pushing these data centers to do this is increase capacity. There's so many new applications. There's so many more new people that are getting on board using data-intensive and latency-sensitive applications. And that just speaks to how you're going to increase the system, requiring faster switching systems and reduced latency. And these systems are huge. They're the size of football fields, in some cases larger. So they need to automate. They basically need to find ways of making smart networks. And reduced power consumption is a major issue for new design. We'll talk a little bit about more about that in a few moments. And then they need to implement new revenue-producing things because they're investing so much money into the expansion of data centers. And reduce hardware and operating costs is almost a given. So the challenge is copper has been the go-to technology for data centers for a very long time. And in applications like, for instance, from a server to the top of a rack, maybe a 2 or 3 meter cable, makes all kinds of sense. It's a relatively low speed, simple to change, very inexpensive. But the other end of the spectrum is the I/O to the outside world is a huge pipe and has very high data rates and must go long distances. And that's where there's a real challenge with copper. This particular chart talks about copper circuits in a printed circuit board. And it says that at 25 gig, you might be able to go 12, 14 inches before the absorption of a signal through printed circuit board material becomes unacceptable. You can go to a more expensive material like the Megtron 6 material, and there you could probably go 50 gig and maybe get about 15 or 18 inches. What happens is, and the laws of physics kick in at this point, the higher the frequency, the greater the absorption, what's called insertion loss, and crosstalk and reflections begin to degrade the signal integrity of the entire channel. So the higher the frequency, the greater the degradation. So copper has some very serious limits that is based on the physics of electronics. When you get to cable, if you look at the top of the chart, that's a twisted pair, shielded pair cable. It can go much, much further with very little degradation. And fiber at the top is almost unaffected by distance. So you can see some huge advantages of fiber for distance as well as bandwidth. There have been a number of solutions that have been proposed, and this one has been implemented now for a number of years. A lot of the modulation of signaling in the past has been what's called PAM, has been NRZ, or non-return to zero. It's simply ones and zeros. Each time you have a transition from a 1 to a 0 or a 0 to 1, you get a bit of data. So you get 1 bit per cycle. PAM4 is a four-level system that transmits essentially double the number of bits per cycle. So you can double your bit rate without increasing the frequency. And that has been a godsend to a lot of designers today because they're able to effectively produce, for instance, a 112 gigabit signal with only a 56 gig only, but actually a 56 gigabit bit rate or frequency. So PAM4 has been very well adopted. It has enabled engineers to work in a range that they feel comfortable with using existing components, and it has extended the life of copper for quite some time. It has its limitations. It certainly does have a smaller signal-to-noise ratio, and it also consumes more power. But it's been adopted by, for instance, Ethernet. The latest Ethernet or PCIe standards are all built around PAM4 signaling. They're now starting to talk about PAM6 and PAM8, but that's yet to be determined if that's going to fly. Another way to be able to transmit data is to simply aggregate lower speed signals and to give you a higher aggregated total throughput. And that works fine. For instance, with a 200 gigabit signal, you have a choice of 8 channels at 50 gig. At 25 gig. 8 channels at 25 gigs gives you a total aggregated of 200 gig. And same thing with 400. And when you get to 800 gig, it gets to be a challenge because at 800 gig, 8 channels of 100 gig each is going to be pushing copper, and your distance you're going to be able to go is going to be quite limited. That 1.6 terabit channels are on the roadmap, and there you would need 8 channels of 200 gig. Not going to be real practical unless they're extremely short copper channels. Another solution that's been proposed and actually been adopted in a lot of areas is using flyover technology. As I mentioned, as you propagate a high-speed signal through a printed circuit board, you get a lot of loss. You get insertion loss, you get crosstalk, reflections. One solution is to take those high-speed signals out of the printed circuit board completely, and you transition them to shielded twisted pair. So you can go from a very high-speed source device directly and go to another place on the printed circuit board, or you can go directly to the I/O. In this particular example, it goes from a switch directly to a QSFP connector, and those high-speed signals never do enter the motherboard. So that also says you can make that motherboard out of a low-cost material because you're only dealing with low-speed signals and power. So there's some cost advantages with that. So all the connector manufacturers now offer a variation of flyover technology. Power is a huge issue right now, where the amount of power being consumed is now at a growth rate that's unsustainable. Back in 2010, we had 640 gigabit switches, and with a very small power budget, or relatively small power budget. 12 years later, we're now at 51.2 terabit switches with a power budget that is 22 times greater. We just can't continue doing that. So there has to be some reduction in the total amount of power consumption at the chip level and throughout the entire channel. So one of the things that can be done is certainly at the chip level, reducing the power consumption. And in this particular chart, it shows, and there's been a variety of different charts that show different percentages, but in this particular chart, they show network hardware is about 10% of the total budget, and server and storage about another 26. So maybe 36% of the total power budget of a data center is consumed in equipment. If you can make a significant reduction in that budget, you not only reduce that amount of power, but you've also reduced the amount of heat being generated, which means you can reduce the cooling budget. So that would help bring down that power level because some of these data centers now are consuming power that equal a medium-sized city, and that's just not acceptable. So that is a major focus for new design. Another area is just the physical space available to get I/O. You can have a box that's really very efficient, generating a lot of computational effort inside the box, but if you can't get it out, you've really compromised what you can achieve. So the I/O panel can be a real pinch point for data. And when you look at a 1U chassis today, that's only 1.75 inches high and 19 inches wide. We're reaching the point now that even pluggable transceivers are limited as to how many you can plug in. And we're at the point now where they're probably not going to be able to support next generation switches in the future. So the question is, if you're going to stay with a 1U chassis, which is really what would be preferred, you need to increase the performance of the pluggables is one solution for sure. And that's really what QSFP double density is all about, and OSFP, because they're shooting for 52.2 terabit switches, I believe, is what these are capable of supporting today. OSFP, extra density, is a developmental product. We expect to hear more about it at DesignCon at the end of the month. It is a new product that has been underdeveloped for probably a couple of years now. And it may be able to support the 52 and maybe 102.4 terabit switches in the future. We'll wait to see. But this variation or this generation of pluggables may end up being the last that is capable of being able to support what is necessary to be able to handle the output of a switch. So optics may be the answer in a lot of applications, or certainly in a greater number of them. You know, it's been a joke in the industry for quite a while that fiber optics are going to take over the world in 5 years. And then each year, that forecast would be, extended. So we're finally getting to the point where I think the laws of physics are starting to put some limitations on copper to the point where, like for instance, in this demonstration, it had a 319 terabit switch, 319 terabit signal that was transmitted over 3,000 kilometers. Something that really you couldn't do with copper unless you had a whole lot of repeaters or amplifiers in the channel. So there's no question that there's some real advantages in terms of reach and bandwidth in fiber. Plus, you can do some additional things with fiber. You can do what's called wave division multiplexing. You can take data and encode it in a variety of different colors, one for each frequency, and then combine them and couple them into a single fiber. So wave division multiplexing can introduce up to 96 channels into a single fiber, which is a great way to go because there's a lot of fiber in the ground today, and it's transmitting one single signal. So using wave division multiplication, you can greatly expand the capacity of that fiber without any change in the fiber itself. Going one step further, you can go to coherent optical transmission. Unlike the one on the right, the image on the right, where that's basically just what's called amplitude modulation, which is just ones and zeros in RZ. You can go to and take the additional characteristics of phase and polarization and encode data in those features of fiber, of light. So now you can take attenuation and phase and combine them and increase even further the capacity of a fiber. At the same time, connectors, which in the past have frankly been kind of a pain in the butt because they were difficult to terminate, required skill, they required epoxy termination, very specialized, experienced people to be able to properly terminate a connector. New connectors now come with pre-terminated ferrules. All you need to do, and they're pre-polished in fact, all you need to do is basically strip, cleave, insert, and crimp, and you got a good, reliable connection. Concerns about end face contamination have largely been taken care of because we have what's called expanded beam technology, which minimizes the effect of contamination on the interface. We also have multi-ferrule connectors. The MPO MTP connector can put up to 24 fibers in a connector that's not a whole lot larger than a RJ45. So you get a great amount of density. You get a lot more MPO connectors on a panel than you can an optical transceiver today. And there are new ferrule connectors that are coming out that are designed to be modular. And so you can get breakouts very easily accomplished, which are important in network and telecommunication applications. So where we're going now is more into bringing that device closer, the optical transmission capability, closer to the source of the high-speed signals. Today, we're using pluggables. So we have an ASIC mounted on a substrate. It's connected via ball grid array to a motherboard. It goes over some distance of printed circuit board, experiencing loss, really. Goes to a clock recovery device, back down into the board, more loss. Finally comes to the transceiver receptacle, and then goes optics from that point out. That's what's being done today. Another approach is to locate the optical engine physically closer to the ASIC itself. So we just have a minimized amount of printed circuit board loss, and then you go optics to the inside half of the I/O panel, and then to the outside world. What's being discussed in a huge way right now, and a lot of money is being spent in developing what's called co-packaged optics, where you mount the ASIC and the optical engine on the same substrate. So the high-speed signals never enter the motherboard, never experience that degradation. Now, it's a whole different architecture, a lot of issues associated with going to something like this, because you're going to have heat. The other optical engines are called chiclets, and they could be located in a circle around a high-speed device. How you manage that, how you power it, how you get the fiber out of there, where you locate the laser that drives these little chiclets, that's all up for debate. But it offers some huge advantages in terms of reduced power, as well as increasing the ability to get those high-speed signals out of the board. Finally, at some point in time, they'll be able to integrate that optical engine into the ASIC itself. Not sure when that's going to happen, but it's the direction that the industry will go. And now you've got electrical signals that will be measured in a few millimeters or less inside the chip itself. So again, less power, less loss, much higher density I/O. So we'll see where it goes. And it needs to happen because the bandwidth of the switch is going to continue to escalate. We're at 51.2 terabit switches now, are just now coming into the market. But there's 102.4 terabit switches already on the roadmap. So it's really an interesting thing to watch how the industry has evolved and continues to evolve. And it's exciting to see how optics may be a major part of that aspect. Appreciate it. And if you have any questions or comments on this, I'd love to have that opportunity to discuss it with you offline. Thank you.